Former police officer Derek Chauvin will be sentenced in about 8 weeks. According to the Minnesota Department of Corrections, he is being held at a maximum security prison outside Minneapolis. Yesterday, the 45-year-old was convicted of all 3 counts against him in the high-profile case that swept the country. George Floyd's murder sparked calls to re-examine racism and policing in the U.S. So for more on this, to break it all down, is Keir Dougall. He is a CBS News legal contributor and a former federal prosecutor. Keir, great having you again. As we mentioned earlier, the jury reached its verdict fairly quickly, I think just about 11 hours of deliberating. What does this timing tell you about their deliberations?
I think it says that the evidence was very strong. I mean, we saw the police officers from the Minneapolis police force testify consistently and strongly that Mr. Chauvin's actions violated that policy. I think the tone, the tenor, the weight of that testimony was very powerful, and frankly was something, maybe new and frankly refreshing. That's one piece of it, addressing the major question of justification and intent on the side of Mr. Chauvin's defense. The other side of the testimony, I thought, that helped the jury resolve this so quickly was the medical testimony. The comprehensive review of effectively the points that would lead to a causation defense or proof of causation. The prosecutors just blanketed that area of the case in a way that I think enabled the jury to move quickly.
Keir, talk to us about the psychology, if you will, of jurors in situations like this. You mentioned, and Anne-Marie mentioned, the speed at which they came back with this verdict. I also thought it was sort of interesting that they didn't ask one question. Did you find that kind of remarkable? And what does that tell you about how the prosecution presented its case and perhaps the way the defense presented its case and the witnesses that they brought up? Because, given that we heard over the course of these 3+ weeks, they were taking a lot of notes, that they were, engaged and, alert as to everything that was being presented to them, I kind of thought it was interesting that there were no questions at all for the judge. What did you think?
Yeah, that's a great question because we often see requests by the jury for specific pieces of evidence that's been admitted, for testimony, sometimes for resolution of legal questions, explanations of the instructions that we heard the judge read. You often see those things in cases where a jury is perhaps struggling, perhaps trying to resolve differences among themselves. And you're right, none of that occurred here. I think that is what shows the strength of the evidence here, that the evidence was strong and clear, and ultimately that the jurors could believe what they saw, as the prosecutors argued throughout the trial.
So there are 3 other former police officers involved in this incident that will be going to trial in August. What does this verdict mean for them? Do they try to pin the murder on Derek Chauvin? Do they become concerned because now clearly a jury has determined that a crime took place and they were part of that? Are they trying to hammer out a deal with prosecutors now? Is that the best advice? What does this all mean?
Yes, Anne-Marie, it's all of the above. They will be going through that mental process with respect to how they will deal with their own charges. I have to say, as a lawyer, as a trial lawyer, what you want to do is to play the cards that you're dealt the best way that you can, right? So as a lawyer, you're dealt facts, you're dealt legal arguments. I thought that Mr. Chauvin's attorney played the hand that he was dealt. It was a losing hand, but he played the hand that he was dealt well. Frankly, I thought that he played his hand well. And so now if I'm one of the other defendants and I'm considering what my defenses might be in my upcoming trial, knowing that that those arguments, those cards were played pretty well and ended up still losing, I think that may shift the thought process among those defendants. I wouldn't be surprised if they were considering a plea at this point.
So Derek Chauvin is set to be sentenced in about 8 weeks. What type of sentencing could he get? And Keir, there was something that it was also interesting. You could either, I guess in Minnesota, you can have the jurors. You can leave it up to the jurors to decide sentencing, or you could leave it up to the judge, and it's actually up to the defendant, in this case, Derek Chauvin. He left it up to the judge. What do you think was the thinking behind that, and what are the pitfalls or the risks or perhaps the upsides in choosing one over the other?
Right. So I think the calculation there is judges see, it's part of their job, but they see crimes. They see lots of crimes. They see these circumstances, frankly, too frequently, but it's their job. And so they may, I think the calculation was that a jury reacting to these facts as a matter of the first time they've really had to dive into a crime like this, might have less balance, might be perhaps more inflamed with respect to what they saw than a judge who has been there, done that, and may react with more experience would. So I think what the calculation was, as the arguments move to what are the aggravating factors that should perhaps raise the calculation for Mr. Chauvin's sentence, what are the mitigating factors, that putting that in the hands of a judge who has seen a lot of these cases and might not, might be more, in their mind, more even-keeled about it. I think that's what led to the decision here to put the decision in the hands of the judge.
In a statement following the verdict, the Justice Department said that it previously had announced a federal civil rights investigation into the death of George Floyd, which is still ongoing. Could Chauvin still face perhaps federal charges?
Yes, he could. And the Justice Department will consider continuing its investigation because the crime that they will be looking at is separate from, it's a different and distinct crime from the murder charge that was brought in Minnesota. The calculation there will be, what does justice look like? There's a civil rights violation that Mr. Chauvin committed because he's acting as a police officer and under the color of law. So he's carrying the authority of his state while he is committing this crime, and that's a separate crime that the Justice Department has jurisdiction over. They may well choose to prosecute him effectively for belt and suspenders, so that if there was a problem with the state prosecution, I don't believe there is, based on what I know right now, but it would put another conviction or potential conviction in place to secure his imprisonment, even if there was a problem with the state prosecution.
Judge Cahill was critical of Congresswoman Maxine Waters. We talked about this, Keir, her comments about the reaction to a potential outcome of the trial. He said her comments might give grounds for the defense to appeal the verdict. How likely do you think that is? What other options does Chauvin's legal team have now at their disposal?
Yeah, I think it's unlikely unless there's some evidence that the jury heard that comment and was influenced by it. So I think that there is that particular issue is unlikely to lead to a problem on appeal. I heard your discussion earlier with Ed O'Keefe about how there are, untoward comments by lots of different Congress people for political reasons. This one, because it was tied so closely to the ongoing trial of Mr. Chauvin, I think was not particularly well placed, not particularly well thought out, frankly. But I don't expect that it will be a problem on appeal unless there's a link to the jury itself.
So we've talked before about the so-called blue wall of silence, right? That even good police officers at times are part of the problem because they're not willing to be critical of bad police officers. So this was a huge change here. Here we saw the actual chief of police testify for the prosecution, as well as other police officers testify for the prosecution. I'm wondering if you think that this case will be a change maker, that this will help to change the culture when it comes to this blue wall of silence.
You know, Anne Marie, I sure hope so. And it's one of these things that I guess we'll have to wait and see. You know, I know in your earlier segment you were talking about, you know, critical moments in American history, Emmett Till and John F. Kennedy and Rodney King, all of these things. You know, when they happen in the moment, it's hard to know how things will change in the future. I certainly hope so. And, you know, we talked earlier already about how the Minneapolis police officers themselves were willing, and to do so effusively in court, to testify how Mr. Chauvin had violated their own policies. And quite frankly, when an officer does that, it makes the rest of the officers, the ones who are the good apples, it makes their job that much more difficult. So I hope that this will be a sea change. I hope that this incentive now to police themselves takes root and does make a change here.
Keir Dougall, always great to have your perspective. Thank you, Keir.
Thank you.